Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome back to speech processing. So this is hopefully going to be a relatively short video. So based on whatever we have studied up until now, we have looked at the resonances that get set up into tubes. We have looked at how the resonant frequencies are related to each other in case the tube is closed at one end, or if the tube is open at both ends, or open at one end. We have also seen how we can model the human vocal tract using either a single or a combination of multiple tubes. So that is what we know and understand until this point. The goal of this video is basically to just combine that knowledge with something that we have studied in some detail previously, which is we would be looking at the spectrograms of vowels and consonants and basically try to consolidate some of the knowledge to see why some patterns are there that we see in those spectrograms. Now, one thing that I would like to make very clear is that this is not a comprehensive video on spectrogram readings, although you will be getting hopefully a lot of information about how we read spectrograms and how we recognize vowels and consonants and even differences between various consonants. However, to go into more details of that, so one thing is for certain, this video will enable you to begin on that path if you're interested. But this won't be a complete video on that topic. So what you can do from here onwards, if you're interested in spectrogram readings, which is that you visually look at a spectrogram and can basically tell what was said, for that you can continue reading. The first resource I would recommend is your book that is also a part of your that was like listed down in your course outline, The Acoustics of Speech Communication by Pickett. I think chapter 4 onwards, it discusses several mechanisms of recognizing sounds and recognizing phonemes, or rather phones, because that's the actual manifestation. So recognizing the phones in a spectrogram. Also, you can basically look it up online, and now I think there are actual competitions where people post spectrograms and others need to respond to those competitions and recognize what was said in those spectrograms and so on and so forth. So I think it's a very interesting and a very, for those of you who are into such things, it's an interesting art. But like every other artwork, this needs a lot of practice. So this is not something that you can do without looking a lot of spectrograms. So the one thing that you really need to do, because these are recordings of actual phenomena, actual voices, so we don't always end up saying exactly what we're supposed to say. So sometimes we are supposed to say a ba, but we end up saying a middle sound like a va or a pa or something like that. So in those cases, you really need to use your experience and your intuition to basically fill in those gaps and figure out, okay, so this sounds like the spectrograms looks like a bilabial, it looks like a stop, but the ba really doesn't fit in here because no word would probably have a ba sound in this place, so probably this is a pa, something like that, or and vice versa. So it would be needing some practice from you if you want to go into spectrogram readings. The goal of this lecture would be that we'll be looking at the spectrograms, we'll be recognizing certain features in those spectrograms that we'll be referring to in the future, like onsets and closures and bursts and so on and so forth. So we'll be looking at those things. We'll also be looking at hissing and noise and high frequency noise and low frequency noise and those phenomena, so that we can refer to them later in an informed manner. We will also be relating some of that with the knowledge that we have already covered or gathered from your perspective in this course. So yeah, let's begin. Let's begin with a short exercise. Consider these three examples. So you are given the length of the vocal tract for a male. In this case, this length corresponds to the average length of vocal tract for average American males, the length of the vocal tract for a female, and the length of the vocal tract for a child. And obviously, these are just estimated and averaged out things. Obviously, child could mean anything from very small babies to early teens. So, but yeah, just consider these three examples and figure out the F1, F2, and F3 for a neutral vowel schwa. You know that in case of schwa, we don't need to consider a system of tubes. We just consider a simple tube which is closed on one end. So calculate the F1, F2, and F3 for all three of those. Pause the video, calculate it, and then continue the video after that. So hopefully you have done your calculations, and now you know that for the same vowel, these three examples, a male, a female, and a child, would be producing the F1, F2, and F3 at very different frequencies. Like the F1 of the male is different from the F1 of the female, which is higher in case of the female, and the child's F1 is even higher. So as the vocal tract is getting shorter, the formants are getting pushed high. They are becoming higher. But still, we keep hearing these phonemes correctly. That's the mystery. That's the interesting part of human perception, human auditory audio perception, that we keep hearing the phones correctly. We still hear it as an we still hear it as an e, oo, whereas the different people around us, like now these were just averages. Even males, like a person could be tall or short, or of a mediocre height, or someone, females could be a tall female, a short female. Similarly, children can be of varying height. So everyone around you essentially is speaking a different but you're hearing all of them saying the same sound, that they intend to speak, and you're listening to it correctly. So see how much diversity there is around you. And you remember, if I said, you remember the time when I said, very early on in the course, and it was a source of mystery for some of the students, that we never, with a very high probability, we never utter the same sound twice in our lives. And by same, I meant all of their, based on all of the acoustic characteristics of the sound. And that is true. Now that you are understanding more and more of these characteristics, you can see how it's almost nearly impossible to create a vowel with this exact same F1 twice. Like there would be some variation. There would be on the continuous value axis, on the continuous time axis, there would be some variation. It would be either slightly longer, slightly shorter. It would be slightly higher F1, slightly lower F2, and so on and so forth. There would be a slight difference. The tongue is slightly up, like by a micrometer. The tongue is slightly down. There would be some difference. So that's the difference, is just the diversity that we produce around the same sound, the variability around the same sound for a single person, and now consider it for everyone around you. So there is a lot of variation. So we are doing a lot of clustering, and very intelligently, and understanding the sounds correctly. So this is really interesting. The another thing that we learn from this is that we are not probably hearing for absolute target values, that if, okay, so the F1 should be 500 hertz. Probably this is not we are hearing for. We are hearing for relative differences and movements. If the formants are going up or formants are going down, if the formants are relatively high or relatively low. So we're looking at differences and movements and relative positioning, rather than absolute target values and absolute differences. All right. So hopefully that is clear. Now with that context, let's proceed. Okay, so you may remember this from your assignment as well, where we asked you to record various vowels and plot them to form a quadrilateral. So very interestingly, the vowel quadrilateral, although also corresponds to the placement of these vowels in the mouth, where this is a front vowel and this is a back vowel, and both of these are high vowels. So similarly, so by here we have called high as closed, so they are more closed vowels. The construction is smaller, and this is a back closed vowel, this is a front closed vowel, these are central closed vowels. These are the most open vowels, and these ones are in the front, and this is in the back, and so on and so forth. The interesting correspondence that we have here is also with the F1 and the F2. So the F1 increases as the size of the constriction becomes smaller. So F1 is is basically lower for smaller constrictions, and like for closer vowels, and F1 is higher for for more open vowels. Similarly, for F2, F2 is lower for back vowels, and it becomes higher for front vowels. And these are some of the things that we can remember in our heads as we look at the spectrograms, and as we see that how these values would be varying, and we can basically use this also to kind of recognize whether a particular vowel that we're seeing in a spectrogram, whether it's a back vowel or a front vowel. So if it's a back vowel, probably F1 and F2 would be close together. if it's a front vowel, then F1 and F2 might be far away from each other, as you can see here, or as you can see here. So the F1 and F2 would be far away from each other. However, in case of these back vowels, the F1 and F2 are expected to be close to each other. So back high vowels would have F1, F2 close to each other. So we'll be looking at some of that in the spectrograms as well. By the way, these axes drawn, F1 and F2, are not drawn to scale. So do not expect that the amount of increase in F2 would be the same as the amount of increase in F1 just because it looks like so in the diagram. This is just showing you an increase, not the relative increase, whether it's equal in case of an F1 and F2 or whether it's different. But yeah, it would be helpful if you remember these diagrams. All right, so let's look at this first spectrogram. Here we have different vowels which I recorded in Pratt. So let's look at them. I have also placed the diagram up here, a small version of it, just so that we have we remember this. So I would ask you to basically pause the video and just stare at this plot for a few minutes. So if you have been staring at it for a few minutes, the first thing that we can actually observe is in the time domain that all of the vowels are producing very high amplitude vibrations. So there is a lot of energy in vowels, and that's a distinctive feature of vowels because the mouth is open. So all of the energy, or most of the energy, which is being produced by the phonation, by the vocal folds, is basically coming out of the mouth, as opposed to most consonants where there are big closures, or the mouth is either completely or partially closed. So some of the energy gets absorbed within the tract and just leaks out through the skin or bone, but it does not like all come out through the mouth. All right. So this is the first thing, that we see a lot of energy. Another thing that you can observe here, so we know that these are the front vowels, E, A, A. So you can see that these are E, A, and A. And these are the back vowels, top to bottom, U, O, O, A. So these are the back vowels, U, O, O, A. And you can see here that the first distinctive feature that we see, that F1 and F2 are fairly away from each other in case of the front vowels. So the way I like to remember it is that for the front vowels, F1 की F2 से इतनी खास दोस्ती नहीं है, F2 की F3 से काफ़ी दोस्ती है. So F2 is friends with F3 and they are close to each other. So you can see that F2 and F3 are close together, but F1 is far away from them. For most of them, but as we come down, because in this case you can clearly see in the quadrilateral as well, in case of A, this is not so distinct. This is almost very close to what you would expect in case of a vowel which has equal spacing between the formants, but at least in the E and A case you can clearly see this trend happening. And if you look at the spectral slice, this is what it looks like. So because of the high F2 and F3, because of the high values of these, they are close together. So this whole part of the spectrum is basically pulled up because of the combined energy. And you can see that here, this whole region is dark. So, and that's the reason for it. So you can even find that this place is dark and this is also dark. So even the places, like the place of the spectrogram within the two formants, is not very light, not as light as say this. Okay, and the F1 is basically separate, and this is the place where we see a lot of attenuation in the spectrum. So these are the frequencies that get attenuated, and we see a lot of white part in the spectrum. So hopefully this is clear. Now let's look at the back vowels. By the way, again, as I said, I'm just going through very brief details. There is a lot more to look at these vowels here, and again, I would recommend the textbook. It has a lot more detail on these things than what I'm covering, or than what I need to cover for the goals of this lecture. All right, for the back vowels, the friendships change. So you see a friendship between F1 and F2. So F1 and F2 are very close to each other, so close to each other that they move up together. And in these cases, it almost seems like one big formant. So these are F1 and F2 almost merged together. And this is why it's happening. There is a lot of energy towards the lower part of the spectrum, and because both of the peaks are joined there, if you look at a spectral slice, you're going to see these two peaks, but the whole region is pulled up. Therefore you see a big gray spot here, a dark gray spot here. So that's in for the back vowels. Now you can clearly basically distinguish just by looking at the spectrogram. If there is a friendship between F2 and F3, then it must be a front vowel. If there is a greater friendship between F1 and F2, then it must be a back vowel, right? And then you can see whether it's low, like almost close to the lowest part of the spectrogram, or it is relatively high, which can tell you. So you know that from top to bottom things move up, the formants move up, right? And here also, here like in contrast, F1 is moving up and F2 and F3 are moving down. So there is a downward moving trend in case of F2 and F3, and in case of F1 the trend goes upwards as we go from top to bottom in the front part of the mouth, from closed to open vowels. And for the back of the mouth, the F1 and F2 together are basically becoming higher. So they're here, and then they're here, and then they're here, and then they're here, and so on and so forth. Okay, so hopefully this is clear, and hopefully you're getting some understanding of this, of what's happening around here. You can see, so this is basically just a replica of the previous slide. I just changed the spectrogram settings a little bit so that you can see the formants a little bit more clearly. And for those of you who believed from the last diagram that they really don't see a difference between F1 and F2 here, in this diagram with these spectrogram settings you do see some differences. You see this slight whiteness here, some whiteness here, some little bit of teeny whiteness here, and some whiteness here. So these are indeed two peaks, not one peak. These are two formants which are moving up together with each other. All right, so hopefully this is clear, and now we can move on to the next topic in this discussion. Another thing that you should be observing from the previous slide is that not all of the diagrams that I'm going to show you here would be able to depict all of the phenomena that I'll be explaining. So there would be cases where I'll be saying, okay, so the formant should be going down here, and you won't see the downward movement. So the reason might be that the sound was not uttered perfectly. The reason could also be that the spectrogram settings are not supporting that particular visualization, that particular thing that we want, that we're interested in. And because right now our goal is not a very comprehensive study of spectrogram readings, we are just looking at some of the phenomena. So therefore it's fine for this. But for if you are interested in spectrogram readings, I would recommend just open up Pratt, and grab a microphone, start recording, and start looking at the spectrograms for the things that I've mentioned, and you'll find a lot of them there. And then read the book, find more patterns, and so on, and eventually you'll be like Neo in the Matrix. I think his name was Neo. Yeah, whatever his name was, the main guy in the Matrix who used to see the zeros and ones coming downwards, flowing downwards like a screensaver. But yeah, we believed it, so that's fine. Hopefully you're believing the spectrogram readings as well, which by the way are real. The idea, I think, from what I understand, initially was presented by Victor Zhu at the MIT. He used to teach that in his classes, spectrogram readings, and then my advisor, Dr. Sarmad Hussain, who was also who taught me speech processing, he basically he also used to do the same in his classes, and I learned it from him. And he used to basically give out prizes in the class for like showing up these spectrograms and asking us what was said, and if we get close to what was said, then he used to give us something. I still have a very nice bottle opener keychain that I won in one of his classes. So yeah, it's fun. Spectrogram reading tends to be fun, especially if you do it in groups. So like do it with your friends and challenge them, and then you'll see how fun this whole activity is. This is an interesting coded language that you're learning to decipher. All right, so you see here he he ha ha and ha ha. So the one thing that I would like to point out here is, why am I starting to embed vowels in phrases? Because that allows us to utter them more naturally. And you'll find that a lot in linguistics, that we don't utter phonemes in an isolated manner, because that makes us utter them in an artificial way. For example, if I say the word so now I'm uttering this artificially. But if I say मैंने आम खाया, so now in the arm there is the and at least in the center of the phoneme you'll see the actual characteristics of a really naturally uttered All right, so these examples are just for you to basically pause the video and find out the same trends that we just discussed before. Whether you see here, so the e, a, I, and a are all front vowels, so you can probably see the friendship between the F2 and F3 here. Again, them coming down slightly. For the short vowel, it's slightly towards the middle as well, but you still see some interesting closeness of these two vowels. This is again coming down, so the trend is going down, and then for the a, it is further down. So you see this downward moving trend, but you see this difference between the F1 and the F2, F3. These are the back vowels. Again, the spectrogram settings here are slightly different. That's why you don't see the same amount of detail here. But anyhow, you see the back vowels. So there's a friendship between F1 and F2. This is ho, ho, hu, ha, and ha. And you can see that we have them here, and then we have them again very close to where they were previously, and then slightly higher, and then slightly further higher. They are also moving away from each other a little bit, as they should based on the vowel quadrilateral. They should be moving away, and they are. But the thing is that because of the combined energy, they're so merged into each other that if you look at a spectral slice, you're going to see the two peaks. You're going to see something like this and this. For the F1 and F2, you're going to see these two peaks here. And even when they move away from each other slightly, the peaks still become something like this, and you see a combined effect rather than an isolated effect. So that's the nature of it. And once you keep looking at it, you'll grow used to it, and you'll start understanding it. By the way, you can also see that for the short vowels, the energy is slightly lower as well, because you've not given it enough time for the vocal folds to basically uh, start revving up to that point. So, or in our case, start vibrating to a very high energy level, and really passing that like air between them, and with a lot of energy. So that's why you see some of these other trends in the side as well. All right. Here you see another phenomena, which is nasalization. And this one is basically, again, nasalization takes a little bit of an eye to look out for once you keep staring at the spectrogram. So I assure you that once we reach the point where we're going to look at nasals embedded in the middle of a spectrogram, they will stand out. They will become very clear to you. But here I just wanted you to compare and contrast. So you can see here, this is an E and this is an E. And the one main difference between the two is that one, they look very similar to each other except for whatever is here, which looks like a formant. It's not. And the second thing, and again, then why isn't it a formant? There's a white line here. It's not. It's a broadened peak. And that's one of the things that nasals do. They bring in zeros in your spectrum. So there are new dips, there are new troughs in your spectrum, and that's why you often see some of these pseudo formants here, which is what's really happening here is that your F1, which was this wide, has become wider. So this is a wider F1, and the overall energy of the whole spectrum is also lower. So you can see that this thing is darker as compared to this thing in terms of its peaks. So one of the impacts of nasalization is that the F1 becomes broader, and therefore it looks higher and wider. Another impact is that all of the formants or the peaks are broadened out and brought down, because some of the energy is leaking out through the nose. Therefore, your formants don't have the same amount of energy, which means darkness in case of a spectrogram. They don't have the same amount of darkness as in case of a non-nasal vowel. So you can see that here as well, E versus E. So you can see like this is clearly lighter as compared to this, very similar but lighter. And this is dark, and this is basically the same thing here. And I know it is confusing. It looks like two formants here, and when you're looking at a real spectrogram, you would be confused a little bit that this could be like you can think of it as an F1 and F2. It's not. But what's going to tell you about this, like the giveaway signature would be that then how could be that F1, F2, F3, and F4 are all so close to each other? They usually are not. So there would be these extra pieces of information that are going to help you when you're going to do spectrogram readings. By the way, can you expect spectrogram readings as part of your quizzes or exams? Yes, but very relatively simple ones. We're going to give you ones where most of the phonemes at least would be simple to understand, and there might be because they would be real sentences. So we would give you word boundaries. We won't, and we would also like give you some hints, but there would be some difficult things in it, some easy things in it. The difficult ones would be difficult for everyone. So hopefully your graphs would be flattened out and relative and comparable as well. But yeah, you should expect some spectrogram readings, but not very difficult ones, and not that, like, we won't base the whole exam on it. Like, expect that as I don't know, some questions, not the only question in the whole exam, like 20% spectrogram readings. It's not that big. All right, so and for a and you see again, this is darker and this is lighter, and you can basically trace the same differences as in the previous ones. Here you see for the back vowels, oo and oo and oo, and because of now the spreading of F1 and F2 have completely merged together. They have become like one big peak. O and O and aw and aw. So again, spreading of F1, which also leads to it merging together with F2. And if you remember, for the back vowels, already F1 and F2 were very close to each other. So once F1 spreads and every vowel comes down and the peaks flatten out, things become more flattened out overall and low energy overall. And here you see aw and ah and ah and ah. And you can see the same, basically the same trends here, although they are not very pronounced here. This does not look very light as compared to this, but that might be because I recorded it maybe separately, or I just said it out in a louder voice. So you see some of the lack of energy here as well, but not here. You can see it here, you don't see it here. So yeah, again, natural phenomena. Not, you don't always see what you're looking for. All right, so this is just again all the vowels on one slide. You have E, A, so E, A, E, A, U, O, U, O, A. And in this case, these were recorded as embedded sentences because you see these movements. So these movements are, as we're going to see, this particular movement happens when we are uttering either an alveolar consonant right after this or a dental consonant right after this. And this movement basically happens, as we're going to see, when we are coming out of a bilabial. So again, these vowels are clearly not recorded in isolation. They were recorded as part of sentences and basically are cut out of sentences. We're going to look at some of that in the coming slides. All right, so this is a more detailed set of features or hints for the various consonants. So you see, you have your places here: labial, dental, alveolar, palatal, velar, laryngeal, and glottal. So you have all of your, basically laryngeal also means pharyngeal. So pharyngeal and glottal, the name that we have used, and you have manners here. You have your glides and vocal stops, voice stops and unvoiced stops, and you have your nasals and you have your fricatives. And here I have basically listed out a bunch of features that you should be expecting for these vowels. Like for the w glide, which is a semi vowel, the F2 comes down and goes up. For the b, you see it's a weak and diffuse spectrum, and you see the F2 comes down and goes up again. So it comes down and goes up. We're going to be looking at that. And for pa and ba, another thing that distinguishes between them is the voicing within the closure. So I won't go over this chart in deep detail. I cover this in more detail when we're looking at explicit spectrogram readings. We are not, so therefore I won't go over this. Feel free to read this on your own and figure out these differences in the next slides as I cover them, but I'll just cover some of those features, not all of them. All right, so let's move on. Okay, so these are the things that we looked at when we were understanding consonants. So we had the manner. So now we had the manner, place, and voicing. So in case of stops, when we are looking at the acoustics or the spectrograms of stops, we find some common things in the manner. So you see something called a closure. So I'll explain to you what a closure is. You'll see a burst in most cases for most of these stops, and I'll explain to you what a burst is. And then, so these things will tell you that it's a stop. So closure and burst are basically signals that whatever was uttered was a stop. And the places would be indicated by the formant transitions, whether the formants are coming down into the closure or they're going or they're basically going up into the closure. And the burst spectrum, so the whether the burst is like it covers the whole spectrum, or it's broken, or it's partial, or it's like only in the higher part. And the voicing and aspiration, so voicing, you'll see voicing within the closures as well for the voice stops, and aspiration you'll see right after the stops. You'll see aspirations like for the bh and a pa and so on and so forth. All right, so these are stops, by the way, are easy to see, like they're as easy to see as vowels in a running spectrogram. I think I find that they're the second easiest thing to detect when you're looking at, for example, if I just tell me where the vowels and stops are, that's a very, very simple task that you need to do for at least most of the stops and for most of the vowels. All right, so here you see appa, upu, ep. Now stare at it for a few seconds, maybe pause the video, and then come back. All right, look at the time domain first. There is basically in these places there is very little of, if any, energy, right? So there's like next to no energy, and there is a very high energy here for the vowels. So appa, upu, and ep. So I've taken basically two from the front, one low and one high, and one from the back high. All right, and now what I want you to observe is the first phenomena that we just talked about. Let me just clean everything up. And that is the closure. So closure is when the lips are closed. So when we close our lips, the only sound that is coming out possibly is through the skin. So this is a very low energy zone. If it's a voiced stop, there would be some energy. There would be at least higher energy than this. So there is some energy in case of voiced, but because pa is unvoiced, so there are no voicing bands here. You don't see any voicing bands here. You see this little thing, but once I'll show you ba, it will be clear to you that this is definitely not voicing. This is basically the trails of the resonant frequency during like the preceding and the following. So this is just co-articulation of these two vowels within the closure. So some remnants of the resonant frequency, like it's happening during the closure. All right, so you know what a closure is. Now the closure is the length of time where the mouth is closed, right? And these are very easy to detect, and they are telltale signatures of stops. So whatever was uttered here was a stop. The second thing that I would like you to observe is this straight line that you see here. So it's more clear here and here than here. So you don't always see it very clearly, but you mostly see it very clearly. This is when the plosive, basically when the sound explodes from the mouth. So ba, ba. So the basically the shock wave, the blast that comes out as the mouth opens up, gives you an impulse like function, a very rich spectrum. And here you see these bursts basically go from top to bottom. They are spread across all energies. So that's basically the second signature of the manner of stop. So closure and burst indicate that the sound was a stop. The third thing that you see here is about voicing. You don't see voicing bars here, so therefore voicing is equal to false, meaning it's an unvoiced sound. You don't see any aspiration here, so I'll show you aspiration, but the onset of the vowels is right after the closure, and that's an important signature. So as soon as the closure ends, here, you immediately see the vowels, the vowels starting, the formant starting. So this is the onset of the formants, and the onset is rapid and immediate right after the closure. If there would have been noise here, and you'll see noise, and it will be very clear, and it's also a very clear thing to see in the spectrogram. So when you see noise here, it means there is aspiration. So instead of a ba, it's like a ba, or a pa. Instead of a ba, it would be a pa. All right. And now finally, to figure out the place, and that is something which is not very clear in all of these spectrograms, but they're clear in some of them. F1 and F2 both fall into the closure and rise out of it. So you can see it here. It's rising out and it's falling in, but this is not very clear. But in many other spectrums of the same vowel, APA, UPU, EP, you'll see, just record it yourself, and you'll probably see this whole thing moving down, and this whole thing again doing like this. So this is kind of a signature. So you can see a little bit of it here, and a little bit of it here, and a little bit here. So just look at this trend, and you can see this curve here, right? And you don't see it very clearly for F1, and you don't see it, a lot of it here. So not all of these phenomena would be visible in all of the spectrograms. As I said, some of them will be very visible, some others will not be, but again, the place here is being indicated by the movement of the formants. Alright, so now compare the APA, UPU, EP with ABA, UBU, EB, and now in this case, observe the same things. You see the closure, you see the closures, you see the bursts. Let me rub this. You don't see a burst in the first one very clearly, but you see a burst in the second one very, very clearly. Let me use this. You see a burst here. It's not very visible here. That's fine. It is visible here in the third one. So you see the burst. You see voicing. Now this is what you call voicing. Compare it with the previous one. I may have a slide where I'm comparing them side by side as well, but feel free to go back in the video and compare. This is very clear voicing bands. Like voicing is low frequency periodic oscillations, and they are very, very clearly visible here. Compare it with the pa. So in case of the APA, UPU, EP, you did not see any major energy signatures here. Another thing that you should be observing is that the period of this, the frequencies rather, the frequency of this is lower comparatively, and you see here basically you see that this is not very densely packed. These are not very densely packed, and because this is coming out of actual phonation, so these frequencies should be similar to the frequencies of the vowels. Similar, not same. Vowels have a more rich spectrum, and this voicing should have a little bit of less rich spectrum. But again, look at this energy, look at the voicing bars, and these two things will clearly indicate to you that there is voicing going on here. So you see voicing, you see burst, you see closure, you see, so you know it's a stop, you know it's a voiced stop. Now the question is which voice stop is it? And again, you can see some of the movements of these formants. Some of them are visible. This is clearly visible. So these movements will indicate to you that it's a bilabial. I know it's not very pronounced here. In many cases, you would just be doing the fill in the blanks here. That okay, it's a stop, it's a voiced stop, and it's a strong stop. But which one is it? It's not aspirated. So is it a ba? Is it a pa? Is it a ta? Is it a ta? And so on and so forth. And then these formant movements will start making more sense as we're going to look at the remaining stops. Alright, so you see the voicing bars. Here are some general guidelines about how these formant transitions work to give you indications about the places. So if you look at the formant transitions for the bilabials, usually the formant transitions are like that. Both F1 and F2 rise out of the closure. So this is right after the closure. So there's a closure here. There's a closure here, a closure here, a closure, a burst here, a burst here, a burst here, a burst here. All right. So they rise out, and similarly they fall in. When they go in, they fall into the closure, and they rise out of the closure, right? For the dental and alveolar, it's a little bit tricky. For E, A, they sort of behave similar to the bilabials, but for A, O, and U, they basically now start showing this different trend where F2 rises into and falls out of the closure, where an F1 basically does this. And this is more clearly visible. For the velar ones, it's almost true across the board that you see this pattern. F2 doing this and F1 doing this. And in the following slides, we'll be looking at some of that. Here is the same thing again, just done a little bit differently. But yeah, again, the same trends that we looked at on the previous slide. This is a ba, a da, and a ga. And you can see that, and here another thing that we are observing is the length. So short versus long vowel is usually um, basically explained based on the length of the vowel. So the short vowels are typically anywhere from 80 to 150 milliseconds, whereas the long vowels are usually around 200 to 300 milliseconds long. There would be variations, but this is the general rule of thumb where you find these in terms of the lengths of these vowels. All right, so here you're going to see for the first time aspiration. So again, look at the graphs. These are apa, upu, ep. Again, observe there is a closure, there is a burst. By the way, bursts are also visible here. I forgot to mention it earlier. You can see the impulse-like function, an impulse-like function here, so which usually is an indicator of the burst. So if the burst is not very visible here, it's mixed up with the oncoming formants or whatever, which is almost always the case when there is aspiration, as it's here. So then a good indicator of the burst is basically in the time domain, not in the frequency domain. So you see, you need to basically look at all of these clues. Now you're Sherlock Holmes. So you're looking at the clues and you're trying to figure out and basically reconstruct what was said. So you see the burst, you don't see voicing, you don't see voicing here or here, you don't see voicing here or here, you don't see voicing here or here. So no voicing, it's a stop, it's unvoiced, and then the onset of the actual vowels is delayed. So there is a delayed onset, and in between them, it's this. And this is a clear signature of rich noise. So there is noise here. It's spread across all frequencies, and it's like all over the place. So this is noise. So therefore, you have a stop followed by a burst, followed by noise, followed by the onset of the next the formants of the next vowel. So it must be an aspirated stop. Pa, pu, pu, e, p. Right? This is the first time you looked at it. Now we'll look at it again. So again, just looking at the details. So I'm calling these ha-like aspirations because we're gonna see soon the spectrum or the spectrogram of the ha sound, the ha, Urdu ha sound, is exactly like this, but it's longer. So when you say a ha, it's longer than this. The aspirations are usually very short. So you see ha-like aspiration with faint formants. Sometimes you're gonna see formants here, broken and very faint formants. But the actual formants would be delayed in their onset. And again, observe these bursts, and these are clearly observable in case of these aspirated stops. You see abha, ubhu, ibhi. Now observe this high energy voicing, high energy voicing. So you see the closure, you see the burst, you see the burst here, and you see the burst here as well. Basically just trace it down and you find the burst here as well, and you find that after the burst, for this amount of time, you don't see very clear formants. So there is no clean onset of formants right after the closure, when the closure ends. So therefore there must be aspiration. So it's abha, ubhu, ibi as opposed to abba, ubu, ibi. All right, now we're moving on to the dentals. So ata, utu, iti, and you observe very similar trends. Like you see the closure, you see the burst. Again, the burst now is hidden almost here, but it's relatively clear here because there is no aspiration. And you don't see any voicing, so all good. But now this is rising up and this is coming down, and this is going down and this is coming up, rising up, going down, coming down, rising up, going down, going down, and this is not very clear what it's doing, but it is technically going down. So for E, if you remember, for dentals and for alveolars, this is not a very good classifier. This is not a very good feature which tells this apart, because something similar was happening in case of bilabials. But for the back vowel U and the front lower vowel A, this is a good indicator. So again, find whatever clues you can find there, to reconstruct what was said. That's the goal. So it's an ongoing, it's an activity where you need to actively look at for whatever clues you find. You cannot go on a crime scene and complain that I don't see very clear footmarks. Yes, you do not. Find out something else. Did you see any fingerprints? You did not. Okay, blame the criminal. Look for something else. And this is how you reconstruct from what you're seeing. And with experience, you start seeing a lot of it. All right, so again, for the place, you see F1 falls into closure and rises out of it for some of them. Um, for vowels with low F2, F2 rises into the closure and falls out of it. Otherwise, opposite. So this is the indicator of the dental place. All right, now you see Adda, Udu, Ed. So dental voiced. Again, you see voicing, strong voicing. You see strong voicing. Everything else is pretty much the same. Rising up, falling down, rising up, falling down, and falling down and rising up. And these are two falling, and this is also falling. So not very reliable indicator. But yeah, you can see a burst. You don't see any aspiration. So it's Adda, Udu, Ed. It's also very difficult to distinguish between this and the next alveolar ones, where some of these trends will become more pronounced. So you basically, the way you look at spectrograms is that first of all you mark out the most easily visible features, and then you move on into the more confusing ones. I don't know in your life whether you have ever performed salt analysis in chemistry. I have, and I used to love it, where you perform a series of experiments on an unknown salt and then figure out what salt that is. And basically it's the same. Like you can see the color and you can basically divide the whole thing. Okay, it's a green salt, so it must be like all the white salts or the yellow salts or the other colored salts are out. Just like whatever green salts remain are now in the picture. So now, okay, if it indicates cobalt, or if it indicates blah, and so on and so forth, and then from there onward you perform your first experiment, and again try to partition your data set into multiple parts until you reach just one or a couple of salts which remain. At that point you taste it. No, you never taste it. Never taste an unknown salt. It could very easily be a very poisonous substance. But yeah, anyhow, yeah, this is how all of these sciences work. All right, you see an Atta, Utu, Iti, and again you see aspirations here. Now I'll try to move a little bit faster. Now you know the basic trend, so I won't indicate to you again that there are bursts here and the closure here, and everything else it's kind of remains the same. You see Adha, Udhu, Idi. Stare at it, and I'm moving on. You see Arta, Utu, Iti, and now this behavior is becoming more pronounced. So this behavior was not very pronounced in case of alveolars, so in case of dentals, but it's more pronounced in case of alveolars, and it's less pronounced. This movement is less pronounced here as compared to the dentals. But this is a dental voiceless stop. Everything else about this you can observe on your own. Yeah, again, you can read it. F1 falls into the closure and rises out of it. For vowels with low F2, F2 rises into the closure and falls out of it. Otherwise, opposite. Again, this could easily be confused with the dental. So yeah, that's there. That's always there. The one thing that will sometimes come to help us would be the F3. So if you're doing an alveolar as a retroflex with curved tongue, then F3 comes down. And then that's a good signature that a retroflex alveolar or a retroflex palato-alveolar was uttered. All right, compared to dental stops, burst is stronger as compared to dental. So these are some of the indications, again, more details of how you can discern things. F2 falls from higher frequencies. If done as a retroflex, F3 comes down. So as we just said. All right, you see Adda, Udu, Ed. Again, figure out the same things. You have the voicing, you have the closure, you have the burst, you have the F1 going up and coming down, and F2 going up and coming down, and F1 going down and coming up out of the closures. All right, you see Atta, Uttu, Atta, Uttu, Iti, and again you see the clear indicators of the ha-like aspiration, and you also see very clearly now, as in case of all of the aspirated stops, that the burst is now very clearly visible in the time domain as well. All right. You see adha, udhu, idhi, and again we know all of the signatures here. All right, moving on to the next place, the velar place. We have the akka, uku, iki, and in this case, what you see is like now that again, I would admit to you from the very beginning that this is relatively, I find it personally relatively hard to indicate. There is some F3 movement which is very clear for these velar stops for English speakers. And they tend to basically rely on those indicators, but once you're going to read the book, you'll find out that, okay, so this is a very reliable indicator of velar stops. For Urdu, we don't see those reliable indicators of F3. So what we see here is essentially that the burst is not as clean as the back of the tongue is heavy. So it does not come out like straightforward out of the closure, because the closures in case of dentals and alveolars and velars are made by the tongue, not on the lips. So because the back of the tongue is heavier and more difficult to move quickly, so therefore the burst is not very closure and not very clean. It's like spread out. It's a thick burst. It's a thicker burst. I should probably make it a little bit cleaner. So it's here. So it's a thicker burst. All right. Um, And again, this is another example of your agga, ugu, igi. So the voicing is easier to indicate, but other things are relatively difficult. So your ka and ga would be a little bit more difficult to learn from at least the first visual inspection. There are other indicators that I don't want to go into at this point. It's gonna make this video way longer than it's intended to be. Already it's consuming almost one full lecture, so I don't want to go into more details to make it more complicated. But yeah, you can read up on this. You can also read up papers about Urdu on this, the velar stops and their indicators in the spectrograms, or you can just do a lot of experiments, and you will begin seeing some of these trends. So yeah, from henceforth, for the remaining consonants, I might go a little bit faster because we need to really finish this in time at least. So we need to definitely restrict this to one lecture and not more than one. All right, so you see akka, uku, iki. You see the noise here, which is the aspiration. You don't see clear bursts as you saw in case of all other types of stops, bilabials and dentals and alveolars. So then it must be a velar because you don't see a very clear burst here. But yeah, again, just reconstructing from clues. Agha, ughu, ighi. This is aqa, uqu, iqi. And again, this time you see the closures to be very clean, and at least for the E example, you see now a very clear indication of this happening. You don't see very clear movement of the F1, but you see very clear movement of the F2, right? In this case, the movement is also clear. In this case, the movement is also a little bit clear. So this is the Hamza sound from Arabic. So the sound. So these sounds are basically u, I. So this is not This is not ain. This is the stop, the glottal stop. U, I. And again, because this is not a very easy to discern place, although it's very easy to discern stop. So there's a closure, there's a burst in some cases, not always, but there's definite closure. So that's a reliable indicator of a stop. So it's a stop. But where's the place? So you see some indication of the movement of F3. So is it a retroflex? No, it's not. You see this movement as well. So again, not very easy to tell the place, but yeah, I won't spend more time on this. I would recommend, if you want to understand how to discern these difficult consonants, you should be reading more of the book. All right, nasal consonants. So for the nasal consonants, you see nasal murmur during the closure. So when you have the closure, you will see some formants going on. That would be an indicator of the nasal consonants. It's a good indicator. And then there would be a closure, and there would be some formant transition. So basically, the formants would go down during the nasal murmur. So there would be a slight transition of formants downwards, showing you the nasal murmur. Here you see it. So this is amma, umu, immi. So you see that you're getting something here. So this is clearly different. This thing is clearly different. So these look like closures, but they're not closures. So like you have these formants going on, but these formants become lighter and slightly lower, shifted slightly lower. And you also see an energy transition here. So all of these indicate that it's a nasal consonant. But what's the place of the nasal consonant? So you see the movements here. The movements are still reliable indicators that you are looking at a bilabial place. So the other possible nasal consonant would be there are some others, but the two main ones are ma and na, and the other one is at the alveolar place, and the formant transitions would be very different. All right, so this is your nasal consonant ma. This is your nasal consonant na, and again you see these closures, but the closures have formants. So that indicates that these are nasals, but the transitions here are now different. The transitions are different. So these transitions indicate that instead of a bilabial place, this is a nasal place. So, but obviously, as we know from before, it's not very clear in case of um, the E sound, as we saw in the alveolar place. So yeah, obviously, tough luck. Not everything is as visible in the first or superficial inspection. When you do a more detailed inspection, obviously, when you're allowed to basically play with this in an interactive spectrogram reader like Pratt, then you can basically measure things and come up with secondary hypotheses. Okay, so this is possibly a ma or a na, so okay, which one is it? And then you measure a few things and then you come up with, okay, this is more like a ma than a na. And there's also a possibility that it's like a mimber thing, so like other phenomena might be happening here as well. Fricatives. So the indicators of the manner of frication is noisiness and frication. So you'll see the noise in the spectrogram. You would see continuity, so there won't be any burst. And for the places, the frequency ranges of the frication usually tell the place. So if the noise is throughout, it must be somewhere lower in the tract. If the noise moves up, it must be somewhere higher in the tract. And the formant transitions are another indicator. So you see here ha, he, and ho, and in all of them you see very rich spectra of the of the noise. So noise is spread all over the 0 to 4000 hertz range, right? Here you see ha, he, ho. So you also see noisy light formants during the noise. So even within the noise, you see some indication of formants going on. So these are some of the indications of ha sound. These are now your sa, sha, fa, and tha, and you have your za, ja, va, and uh, tha, the. So these are all of your. So this is your the, and this is your tha, and now in between them you can clearly see that this one has very high frequency noise. So you have around 3000 hertz. So noise begins around 3000 hertz in case of the sa and za, and you don't have voicing here and you have voicing here, which will also be indicated in the time domain plot. We don't have the time domain plot here, but the time domain plot would be a very clear indicator of whether there is voicing or not. Voicing usually has very periodic time domain plots, whereas noise does not have periodic time domain plots. So what you're going to see here is noisy periodicity. You're going to see noisy periodicity for these voicings, like in a za. And here you would just have noise. You would just have noise in this case. All right. For the sha, you see that the noise begins around 2000 hertz roughly. For the fa, it's spread all over, just like a ha. So it's difficult to discern between a fa and a ha. That's true. But fa and va, so the va would have voicing both in the spectrogram as well as in the time domain very clearly. And for the next ones, again, these two are easy to confuse with each other, but usually formant transitions are the ones which help you discern between these two. One is labiodental and the other is simply dental. Labiodental and dental. All right, so I'm again, just like in the previous slides, I'm just going over the more superficial signs and not going into the details of more difficult to interpret signs, which is again a topic which needs several lectures on its own, which we're not going to do. All right. At least not in this course. All right, so you have afa, ufu, ifi. Now this is for your own pleasure. I won't go into the details here. Just look at it here and try to find out whether you can figure out the labiodental placement from the formant transitions, whether you can recognize the vowel, the actual noise. Look at it here. Whether so, just look at the magnitude of this noise here, because this is a voiceless fricative. And this is ava, uvu, ev, and now look at this. This is a voiced fricative, so you can clearly see it. However, now this thing appears white. Why is this white? Because you have a very high energy voicing at the beginning of it, the rest of it seems whitened out. So the energy is shifted towards the voicing part of the spectrum. It does not mean you don't have the same noise here, but the magnitude of the noise is much lower compared to this, and because the spectrogram is a relative plot in terms of its darkness, therefore you're not seeing the noise anymore. But like, how would you discern it? This almost looks like a closure. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. It's one of the difficulties of reading the spectrogram. We don't have an answer, a perfect answer in all cases. All right, you have asa, usu, isi. So sa and sha are usually easy to detect, but these are also known as stridents. So the noise is very high intensity. So you see very high intensity noise here. So this is clearly noisy. This does not appear very periodic, but it is very high intensity. So high intensity, high frequency noise is sa. And high intensity, high frequency noise with voicing. So you see now, and by the way, when I'm saying this looks periodic, this looks periodic to me. It may not look periodic to you, but trust me, as soon as we will start doing the time domain methods, and you will be finding out these by writing your own code, you will start seeing it. The reason I am easily detecting it is that because these are sparse. So when you have periodicity, you see a lot of white in between here. When you don't have periodicity, you see like a whole black mess. So therefore that's an indicator of whether it's just pure noise or some periodic waveform here. But you have voiced high frequency noise, which is z, the same place as sa, but za, aza, uzu, izi. You have a sha, ushu, ishi, and sha is very easy to detect. It's like around 2000 hertz location from where the noise starts. It is again a strident. The noise has a lot of energy, but not as much energy as the voiced version, the ja of it. And this is the ja, ja, uju, iji. But again, in this case, you don't see a lot of it. Because probably the neighboring vowels were very high. But yeah, in many cases you will see a very high voicing here, but you see the voicing bands. You also see some formant transitions in the noise. So this is noise, but you see sometimes the noise also, because the noise can also set up the resonances. It does in most of the cases. So you sometimes also see the formants in the noise. By the way, just an observation, this looks like a nice human face. It has two eyes and a mouth and eyebrows. Yeah, just pointing out. I don't know, we need to have some fun, but yeah. Let's move on. All right. You see aha, uhu, ihi. By the way, if at any of these stages in this lecture you start feeling, okay, this is too much information and this is too confusing, you don't need to remember all of this. Just look for the main signatures. I'm telling you almost all signatures here, but I'm expecting from you just the more superficial and the simple signatures, not the more difficult ones, right? So yeah, you can tell apart vowels and consonants, right? You can tell apart stops. You can tell apart probably sha. So you're good. You're good to go. For the other ones, for the more detailed ones, you can basically do more practice if you're interested in it, and do it on your own. But we are expecting like the basic knowledge of spectrogram reading from you, and more importantly, just the link between why these things are happening. So for example, for the sha, there is noise, and you see noise in the spectrogram. For the formants, you now clearly know the reasons why these resonances are set up the way they are. All right, you have the akha, ukhu, ikhi. Moving on very quickly, you have agha, uru, iri. Again, there is a lot of information here which I'm not deciphering for you. Uh, you can read the book for more details of this. Aha, uhu, ihi. And for the affricates, there are also many indicators. There is a closure, there is a burst, there is noisy frication. So because for the affricates, it's basically half of it is a stop and half of it is a fricative. So you'll see the behavior of both the frication on and the stop in it. So if you remember, the cha was ta sha, ta was the stop, and sha was a strident. So you're going to see both of them, and the places would be indicated by the frequency range of the frication, just like the sha and the formant transition. The voicing and aspiration would be indicated by the voicing during closure of the stop part of it, and the aspiration obviously would be indicated like the cha and the ja by aspiration right after the actual phone. So you see the acha, uchu, ichi. So you see a closure here, you see a burst, then you see high frequency shas here. So you have a ta and you have a sha. You have a ta and you have a sha. You have a ta and you have a sha. Right? So it's not that we just say that we have a ta and a sha. We actually have a ta and a sha here. And these formant transitions can further indicate the places that these are indeed palatal places which are beyond the alveolar place. So we see these going up, coming down, coming down, coming up, and so on. All of these. All right, and we have the voicing in the ja. So you have the da, you have the da. Sorry, not bigger. You have the da with its own burst and its own closure, and you have the j here, and you have the voicing in all of these to indicate that this is a ja. All right. You have acha, uchu, ichi, again making it a little bit more complicated. So you have a ta, you have a sha, and then you have this noise. You have ta, you have a sha, and you have this noise. Again, not everything is very visible here, but yeah, you can see that once you know what sound was uttered, you can figure out what parts of the spectrogram have it, and you can do some of this reverse engineering as well. All right, this is the ja, uju, iji. And for the alveolar trills, the place would be indicated by formant transitions, and the manner would be indicated by repeated short closures, because for the trill it's like a rrr. So there's a discontinuous spectrum that you're going to see here. So this is your ara, uru, iri when done as a trill, and so you can see some of this discontinuities going on here. So some discontinuities going on here. Again, not very visible to very untrained eyes, but yeah, eventually as you grow into looking at these spectrograms, you will very easily discern them. And we're going to also look at some sentences, so it's going to become clearer when we get there. All right, so retroflexed flap. The manner is a short closure, and the place is indicated by low F3 for retroflex. All right, so this is your ara. So this is retroflex. Okay, so arda, uru, ed. So you can see these movements. You can see these movements. F3 is very clearly a part of these movements, and then you see a very short instance of what interesting things are happening here. So yeah, this is again not very difficult to recognize. Ra is relatively easy to recognize because F3 gets involved. For alveolar lateral like la, you see a flat non-transient murmur, and the manner is low amplitude murmur. So this would be very similar to ma. So la and ma are difficult to differentiate. In fact, la and na are also difficult to differentiate, because for la your tongue is at the alveolar place. So this is going up, this is going down, this is going down, this is going up. So the same, if you remember, happened in case of a na. And you see a formant transition. So this is very similar to nasalization. So yeah, these two are difficult to set apart, like la and na are difficult to set apart. I agree. But yeah, these are the discerning characteristics insofar as they can basically bring you down to a smaller set of things. Okay, this is either a la or a na, and then you can use the context to basically figure out which one was it. All right, so this is aya, uyu, iyi, and in these cases, this trend will become very clear. The one that I called the mouth earlier, this trend will become relatively clear. So aya, uyu, iyi. So these are again some of the indicators here would be common for a small subset of sounds. So that's what I mean when I say when you look at a lot of them, you start seeing these patterns. Okay, so I see a face here, I see eyes here, I see eyebrows here. Okay, these are your pseudo markers that you can basically used to start seeing these patterns in these graphs. I see a face there, I see a frowning face, I see a happy face, and okay, now you're seeing the sounds actually. So yeah, they're just your personal hints of what to look at in the spectrogram. This is basically the rung sound. So anga, ungu, ingi. So you see again the trends here are similar to Urdu sound as well. You have some nasalization patterns here as well. So the lighter formants and formants going down. So some nasal-like behavior because obviously it has a na in it. So you see some na-like behavior and then you see some ga-like behavior, which is visible only for a very short time here. Some na and a ga-like behavior that indicates the basically the ingma sound. All right, so again, now I have some combinations of sounds just to show you some spectrograms that you can play with on your own. So pa, pu, pi, ba, bu, bi, and you can see here, you can compare these in terms of energy to see voicing. Pa, pu, pi, ba, bu, bi. So now very clearly the bursts are visible here, and here you can see the very high energy voicing in the closures. You see tha thu thi, dha dhu dhi. Again, pause it, uh, look at it on your own. Tha thu thi, dha dhu dhi, ta tu ti, da du di. Many of the things which were not visible in the original spectrograms are now more visible here, like the formant transitions. You can clearly see these transitions. You can see these transitions. So many of these things are now more visible, and you can basically at your own leisure you can look at them in more detail. One of the reasons why I came up with this slide deck was that all of this information is spread across books and across many places, so I just tried to combine it in one place. Unfortunately, in this course, we don't have the time to go into each and every detail of understanding them. So I've just have them here. You can read the book and come back to these examples to just look at these as samples, as samples of the sounds in one place, or you can do the recordings yourself as well. This is ta tu ti, da du di. Observe these, very clear. Observe these voicing, again, very clear. Ga gu ki, ga gu gi. Again, as we said at that point, that you don't have very clean bursts here. You don't always see a very clean burst here. Sometimes a broken burst is an indicator of that as well. Ka ku ki, ga gu gi, ka ku ki, a u i, fa fu fi, wa fu vi. Observe the voicing. Sasusi, zazuzi, the high energy noise available here as visible here as well. The shashushi, jajuji, stridents, high energy voicing. Hahuhi, raguri, we did not go into a lot of detail of this. Hahuhi, noise, in some cases very clear, in others not so much. Then you have chachuchi, jajuji, relatively easier to recognize. Burst plus frication, burst plus frication, burst plus frication. And you have chachuchi, jajuji. Again, you can observe the aspiration here as well. So right after this, you have the aspiration here. All right, you have mamumi, nanuni. You have raru, raruri, raruri. You have la, lu, li. And you have apa, ata, ata, aka. So I arranged these so that you can basically look at these movements and you can figure out how do you recognize the places. So many of these slides are for your own practice and not so much for the instruction. You have abba, ada, ada, aga. trace the places yourself. Allah, Amma, Anna. So I place them side by side. So for the La and for the Ma, this indication is relatively clear. For the Na and for the La, it's a little bit more confusing. But yeah, they are similar. You can, one possibility is you can just use the context to discern between this and this. But there are also other indicators that I'm not covering here. You have aja and then a diphthong aiya, and these two are very similar to each other. Remember when I told you eyes and mouth? So you see eyes and mouth in both ya and aiya. So aya versus aiya. So this is usually shorter and this is usually longer. So the mouth is more open here as compared to here. Again, personal indicators. uh, Ra and Ara. These two are similar to each other, but one indicator is F3 movement, which is not so much here as here. It's present here. So for the Ra sound, the F3 moves a lot. Now, this is for you. So pause the video and try to figure out what was said. My hint to you would be just try to figure out first where the vowels are. Then try to figure out, do you see any bursts? Do you see any closures? Do you see any open mouths and so on? And try to indicate, do you see any brokens here, any broken sounds here, right? And then once you are done with that, I'm about to reveal it, so pause the video if you want to play with it and test your own skills. All right. झूठ बोलना अच्छी बात नहीं है. झूठ बोलना, झूठ. So this is your jha, u, ta, ba, o, l, n, and so la and na came together. बोलना अच्छी बात नहीं, and so on and so forth. So you can basically keep tracing that, keep playing with that for a few minutes. So I'll just clean it out for you. So trace it at your own leisure. But yeah, let me give you another one. Okay, pause the video, try solving this. By the way, these are relatively difficult ones. If we give you something which is as difficult as this, we probably would give you some hints along the way of what to recognize. All right, I'm revealing it. Khoda pahar nikla chuha. All right, so try to recognize these things. You can easily tell apart where the vowels are and where the stops are, but many other things are not as easily discernible. Here's another one. It's a shorter one. It has some long vowels, as you can see. Asteen ka samp. Right? So try mapping out these phones in these graphs. All right, here's another one for you. Kitab tabdeel ho gayi. Kitab tabdeel ho gayi. All right. Here's another one for you. About to reveal now. कपड़े धोने के साबुन का झाग. So these sentences are not now making a lot of intuitive sense either. So it's a grammatical sentence, but probably you won't very easily be able to come up with it if you just try to guess what was said. You would need to do some, at least, mapping here of between the spectrograms and some of the sounds. So fill in the blanks first and leave some of the open blanks, and then try to fill them using the context. Like if you figure out the pa here and the ra here and the a here, then probably you can figure out the ka here just based what word would be with a pa da ya. That's the problem, that we have not given you word boundaries here. But if we give you word boundaries, that okay, so this is one word and this is another word and this is another. If we do it like this, then it's relatively easier. And usually for testing purposes, this is what we do. Otherwise, it's like a whole statement without any word breaks. So it's difficult to even read such a statement. Just take this Urdu sentence and combine it together, and it would be very difficult to read for you. All right, so we are at the end now. We have gone through spectrograms. We have seen some of the spectrographic correlates of the acoustic phenomena that we understood. So now that part is complete. And in the next lecture, we will start looking at, inshallah, the time domain methods. And some of these things that we have visited another layer down, you would be getting more details of how these things work. All right, so we'll stop here. Inshallah, let's meet again in the next lecture.